And on the flip side of that, I get to work with our lovely athletic staff and coaches and help them with all their alumni efforts. And then since we've transitioned into a world of virtual events, I've kind of taken over and managed some of these great webinars that we've had come out of the office. So that's just a little bit about me and what we do in our office. And we do have an open door policy. We're here for you as alumni, current students, friends of the university, anything like that. We want to keep you engaged as best we can. So we're here to help. So feel free to reach out to us at any time. And then just a couple housekeeping items before we get started. So you'll notice as a guest, your cameras and microphones are turned off during the presentation. That's just to prevent any kind of feedback or anything like that from the presenters while they go through their presentation. So we'll keep those turned off for guests throughout. If you do have a question or a comment throughout the presentation, drop it to us in the chat box. You should find that in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. There's a couple purple arrows down there. If you click on those, it'll open up a tab, and you can see the chat box there. So feel free to chat us any questions or comments throughout. And then also, if you have any camera, or if you can't see us or you can't hear us for any reason, chat us in the chat box. We'll try to get it figured out with our IT team. And if anybody has any questions before we start, feel free to drop those in. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Scott, Sara, and Libba, and they can take it away.
Great. Thanks so much, Alex. So thanks to everyone for joining us tonight, especially for those who might be weathering the storm that's going through the DeLand area. I know that's always kind of like puts everybody a little bit at a nervous state. But anyways, it does look like we have lots of great information tonight. I'm going to be talking a lot about some of the professional leagues and how they've been impacted as far as the pandemic overall. And then we also have, besides just myself, we also have Scott, who's going to be talking a little bit about sponsorships and some of the partnerships that he talks about in class for his sports properties class. And we will also have Professor Libba Galloway, who will be discussing a little bit more kind of the back end of the pandemic and how that affects some of the players and keeping fans safe, as well as the players safe and so forth. So there's a lot to really tackle. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of talk about one area that I discuss in my Intro to Sports Marketing or Intro to Sports Business class, and that's really looking at professional leagues and professional sports leagues. So overall, right now, it's estimated at about a $12 billion will be lost. That's what ESPN has been mostly reporting for the last month to 2 months. So 12 billion overall between all the major leagues, professional sporting leagues. So that would include 3.25 billion by fans that they would normally pay to go to a game. So that's not only the ticket, but the parking, the concessions. If there is a program, some kind of merchandise that they pick up. So that, actually, some people even question that that might even be a low number. There's also $371 million in wages. So anything right now, I feel like most of the leagues right now are trying to sacrifice the season just to try to maybe alleviate some of the wages that they would have to put out. TV will lose about 2.2 billion. And even if you look at, besides just the professional, the pro sports leagues, even youth sports, which we do discuss quite a bit in the intro to class, they are going to lose about $2.4 billion. And that's a lot, especially when youth sports is really run mostly on a shoestring as it is. So I know for a fact with my own daughter, she plays on a travel soccer team, and she was supposed to go to Tallahassee for the weekend. She's been looking forward to it all year. And of course it was rescheduled, then it was finally canceled and so forth. But that's a lot of money that we would have then spent on that trip for her. So really at this point, most of the sports leagues are just bleeding dollars. So it really becomes, an issue as to how can we stop the bleeding in general. So Florida has become really the hot spot as far as sporting leagues and where they want to practice or try to kind of complete or finish out their season overall. Unfortunately, Florida has also become the hot spot and a hard-hit state as far as it comes to cases of COVID-19. So the unfortunate timing of all of this is really been serendipitous as far as just the numbers have really shot up. I know here where I live in Tampa, the last 2 days has been 4,000, it's really been a bigger. The numbers have been higher than even when we were quarantining. So I think it's just really starting to hit people very hard, and that could have been because of Memorial Day. There was a different protests, things like that. A lot of activity where people were very close together, but that becomes a very big issue as where some of these teams are then practicing here in Florida. So the WNBA is going to be at the IMG Academy. World Team Tennis is going to be in Greenbrier starting July. The NBA is going to be in Orlando. The Premier League has already started. They started about a week ago or maybe 10 days ago, and just was reported today that an Arsenal player tested positive. So they have 18 positive tests already. So even though they have started their league and they're trying to finish out their season without fans, they're starting to see an increase in a pop in the numbers as far as cases among the players. So that's a little concerning. The NHL has not yet disclosed exactly where they're going to be playing. And it does look like it most likely it's going to be Vegas and Canada is probably my best bet. But I know Chicago has also been in the running, and they've really been hurting for tourism dollars because they were really hit hard by COVID-19 as well. And then we have Major League Baseball, which is kind of the wild card. It's almost kind of interesting to me that Major League Baseball is still kind of at a standstill between negotiation contracts with the players union. It really looks like it's going to be Arizona and Florida with the 60-game proposal that they have out, except for now some of the teams have already started to see a pop in their numbers as well. I know this week 4 members of the Yankees staff, I believe, I don't think it was necessarily the players, were tested positive in Tampa. And there was also 8 Phillies out in Clearwater. So Major League Baseball really has had an ongoing battle between the front office and the players. And I have a couple insiders in that, and I know that they've really been trying to battle that out. So we'll see if they really actually get that 60-day or 60-game season off or not. Then with the NBA, as you may know, they're going to be at Walt Disney World, and they have a few different, hotels that they're going to be staying at, 3 different hotels. And this was really driven by the fact that Disney in general has been very obviously hurt by tourist dollars, if you can imagine that. Obviously Disney is a very big business and organization, but just Florida in general, and then Disney as well. So this was really set up to kind of benefit both of those organizations, not only the NBA, but also Walt Disney. So the players actually still have to notify the league, I think it's by the 24th, if they're not coming back, if they're not going to resume the league. So they have given them a choice. But what's really interesting is they set up this like almost mini bubble for them, or if they've really tried to, and it's pretty luxurious with some of the hotel amenities. Like I said, they're going to be at 3 main hotels, and the players have their own player lounge, which is going to be NBA 2K and TVs and gaming stations set up. They'll have barbers and manicurists, masseuses as well. They have a 24 concierge. And what's sort of interesting, which to me kind of goes against this whole bubble, is each player will have be allowed to, at their own expense, secure 17 hotel rooms. So that almost then, to me, my personal opinion, opens this bubble up a little bit bigger, or a lot bigger, really. So if you think each hotel room could have, maybe up to 4 people in that, they will, be, using masks and so forth, and they can go see some of the other games, if they're not playing and so forth. But I did think that that the hotel rooms was kind of interesting, and obviously becomes a very much a business, decision overall. In fact, we have been working with the Orlando Magic, my sport media class. There's one of my former students, Josh, conducting an interview. So that's one of the great perks about that class, that usually we are able to secure. It looks like we'll be able to do that again. Students actually go before the game and interview the coaches and go down on the court side and watch them warm up. Then they watch the games usually by in the press room, and then afterwards they get to go into the locker room and conduct more interviews and so forth, and then they do a game write-up. So it's a really great opportunity to get a different perspective and get a journalist perspective. So in case that's something that students want to go into, or in case they're working on the other side, the marketing end of it, they get to see what's really needed as far as media. So looking at the NFL, to me, with Major League Baseball, that's the one league that I think that should be up and running easier than any other league because of the ability to have more distance between players and so forth. But with the NFL, this is obviously a completely different beast. So they're really hoping to have training camps open by late July. But there's a noted fact that many of the players will fall into a at high risk category, and that would be because they have a high BMI and that they're African American. So this may be very hard for the NFL actually to conduct games and be a lot harder just because of social distancing and so forth. So, and the fact, I guess, if you think about it, NFL with football, you just need a lot more players there. The teams are bigger and so forth. So the NFL might have a bigger risk than any other league in general. So I have been working with the Super Bowl committee for next year, and they are still trying to kind of figure out their guidelines. We will be opening up some opportunities for students, for our Stetson students to work Super Bowl next year. And so we're kind of still finalizing some of the detail, but hopefully it'll either be for ELR credit or a class or something of that nature. But the Super Bowl committee is pretty upfront in stating that they're not sure what those guidelines are going to look like, and what kind of rules they'll have to put in place. So that one is still a big league, a big moneymaker league, and one that is going to be very much challenged, especially if you think about even a Super Bowl is going to be 60,000 people. How do you sit them far apart? Do you see them close together? Professor Jones and I were even talking about do maybe some people want to sit with their friends and they're okay with that, and other people are not. And what would be the premium ticket for that? Would that be to sit with your friends and sit as close as you want, or the premium ticket price, would that be something that's more like where you are further away from other people? So there's a lot to be considered when it comes to that. And then obviously esports has really had a very positive impact as far as really gaining a lot of popularity. And there's been a lot more agents who have gone into that, sports agents who have gone into the esports arena. So I think that will just continue to grow now exponentially, even more so than what experts expected before. So that's just kind of a big snapshot. Again, we talk a lot about professional sports, but also collegiate sports and youth sports in the intro sports class. But that kind of just gives you kind of a business side of what the pro sport would look like. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jones, who will give you his view on some of the sponsorship and properties and the impact that they had.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, and a real pleasure to see some folks, some students here joining us this evening. I wanted to appreciate Sarah mentioning some of the impact on revenue for lots of different sport properties. And the primary thing I was planning on chatting with you a little bit tonight is specifically related to the sponsorship category, at least that revenue stream. But just to sort of follow up real quickly on some of the things that Sarah mentioned there, obviously when we're postponing or canceling events, we know that the ticketing revenue is going to be down. As Sarah was reporting, ESPN estimating that in several billions of dollars. One of the things that is not normally included in that type of calculation is thinking about 5K runs and Tough Mudders. And I'm someone that tries to do a triathlon or two a year. And I was thinking about the St. Anthony's Triathlon in St. Petersburg, which benefits the children's hospital over there. And we're talking about something here that, several $billion in entry fees for participants in order to participate that are also lost if an event gets canceled such as this. And so it's not just obviously professional sports, collegiate sports, little leagues, and things of that nature, but many organizations that do Me Strong events and Tough Mudders and triathlons are also obviously struggling at this point. Ticketing is obviously one big source of revenue. Licensing is another, and that is, of course, the generated by manufacturers that pay a royalty fee for the use of intellectual property that's owned by sport leagues. One of the things that occurred to me is with the cancellation of the NCAA basketball tournament, pretty much every year, if you're a fan of the tournament, you know that there are teams that get labeled as Cinderellas, sort of underdog stories that come out and win a game or two. I remember Florida Gulf Coast University several years ago that had some success in the basketball tournament. And what happens when you have those events, of course, is that the sale of licensed products for Florida Gulf Coast, in that example, go up quite a bit in a very short period of time. And it's worth noting that that's typically revenue that is shared amongst all the schools in the conference. So when you have Florida Gulf Coast jerseys flying off the rack, it also can benefit Stetson University as a member of that conference as well. And so you can imagine, while there's still plenty of Tom Brady, Tampa Bay Buccaneer jerseys being sold right now, that licensing revenue is likely relatively stable, but we can still think about situations where, again, a Cinderella or a MLB team that maybe wasn't anticipated to have a great season at the start of the year, they get off to a really hot start, and a lot of bandwagon fans jump on board, and they like to purchase licensed materials and products to show that affiliation. And those are things, of course, that are lost in this situation. As most of you are aware, the media revenue is the largest source of revenue for most major professional sport leagues, and that obviously when the games don't occur, the events don't occur, those become sort of complex relationships between the media partner and the sport property about how to move forward with that. In many cases, of course, the media partners have long-term contracts with sport properties, so losing a golf tournament for CBS in 1 week doesn't mean that they're not going to be, remain in that contract and be broadcasting events down the road. One of the things that did occur to me just on the media side is that for some media companies, the rights to be able to rebroadcast major sporting events may become more attractive now. Certainly when you have things like the Golf Channel and ESPN that have 24 hours of time to fill up in a day, and you lose live sport for a while, the importance of being able to rebroadcast or replay many of these events becomes maybe a little bit more valuable for media companies moving forward. So media, licensing, and ticketing revenue, we all know, is going to face downward pressure during this time. What I wanted to turn to specifically are sponsorship contracts, and to paint a broad picture about what has happened in the agreements between sport properties and sponsors during this time is very difficult, because there's lots of different types of sports properties and there's lots of different types of sponsorship contracts. And really depending on the nature of the contract, those are some of the key things that would drive whether rights fees that a company has paid must be reimbursed, or whether those are just going to be pushed down the road. Those are all things that individually these contracts will now be covering, and companies will be going back and revisiting exactly what they're getting for their in this agreement. But some of you have taken some of my classes before and know that we spend a good deal of time talking about, what is it that sport properties can offer a brand that is of value to a company, that they can then convert into their own return on investment. And one of the simple ways to think about it is that the collection of inventory that someone like Florida Hospital or MasterCard in the visual examples here get, they get some inventory such as intellectual property and obviously the rights to be able to claim I'm the official hospital of Orlando SC. Those are all parts of that sponsorship contract that the companies can still use. Obviously, to be able to produce a billboard, We Dig Purple for Florida Health requires the access to the logos and the intellectual property of the team. And for companies that have with sponsorship contracts, they can still use some of that inventory in their own promotions. But the bullet points at the top of the slide there emphasize, of course, that not if you're canceling events, obviously a good bit of what brands have paid for through this sponsorship agreement is not going to get to be used. Or as we begin to move forward here and we begin to play events, maybe in the case of the NBA down at Disney, so they're no longer playing in their home arena, where home team advantage and things of that would be present, but also playing again in front of reduced capacity crowds. Companies are paying in part to reach certain number of eyeballs. MasterCard, as a sponsor of a PGA Tour event, has the expectation that they will be able to reach maybe as many as 500,000 people that attend that sporting event over a 4-day period. The picture there at the top is of a MasterCard hospitality suite at the Bay Hill tournament. So you can imagine that in a restricted capacity situation, that hospitality suite is also limited in terms of the number of people that MasterCard can invite in at any given time into that suite. So if you're just considering, what's the inventory that a sponsor receives that are related to the event, all of those things are obviously reduced in value if the event is played in front of no people or reduced capacity. While there are some other things, such as the use of the intellectual property, that sponsors can still continue to use. There's a couple things that I'm really curious to sort of follow. Frankly, there's 1,000 things I'm curious to follow over the next few months and year, just looking at what are things that are going to be temporary and what are things that are going to be permanent. Dr. Galloway may get into this first bullet point here in just a moment, but one of the things I was speculating is that most sponsorship contracts have clauses that address whether an event gets postponed or canceled. Obviously, that can be weather related. It could certainly be a health crisis such as this. But what I am curious about, number one, is to what extent contracts moving forward will include stipulations for the event happening, but it occurring in front of no fans or restricted capacity. And I suspect that many sponsorship contracts at this point don't have those types of stipulations. Another interesting thing is to what extent these contracts have to be renegotiated or changes to existing contracts. The top visual there, if you think about naming rights for a stadium, such as Amway, one thing that Amway anticipates is that there's a certain number of events that are going to be hosted in that venue, not just Magic games, not just Solar Bear games, right? But ice capades and truck shows and motocross things. And so there may be changes in that contract or adjustments that have to be made simply by there being that many fewer events in a given year. One of the other things I'm personally very curious about is, if you think about it, many of these companies that were anticipating investments in sponsorship have had, in essence, the opportunity to reallocate that budget. I have a visual up there for Coca-Cola and the NCAA basketball tournament. Coke not just pays, obviously, a very large rights fee for the access to, to be the official sponsor of that event. They probably spend about 4 or 5 times that in activating the sponsorship. And what we mean by that is running advertisement, creating advertising that communicates the sponsorship. And I'm really going to be curious, in some sense, you could say it's a test of sponsorship as a promotional investment for companies. If they've taken some money that they were going to spend on sponsorship and have reallocated it to some other promotional option, companies have a natural experiment here where they can test how effective is sponsorship. Is it the right investment for us, or maybe us being forced to invest in some other option for promotional purposes? We learned that investments in social media are better for us or more valuable. And in that sense, I think for sport properties, especially those people responsible for selling sponsorship, it's going to be very interesting to see how quickly the sponsorship dollars come back for companies that may have reallocated those investments elsewhere. The last bullet point here before I turn it over to Libba is just thinking about how inventory that gets offered as part of a sponsorship package may change. One of the things I was noting, I've been watching a little bit of PGA Tour golf this week, and at RBC, Royal Bank Canada, was the official sponsor of the PGA Tour stop up at Harbortown in South Carolina this weekend. Obviously, the golf course did not have the hospitality suites that we would normally see, did not have the signage on the golf course. One of the things I noted was that there appeared to be a lot more virtual signage that was embedded in the broadcast. So CBS was the broadcast partner, and there were a number of occasions where on the green itself, they would virtually embed, using the same technology that broadcasters use for a first down line in the NFL. They can embed advertising in the broadcast itself. And I noticed a lot more of that just in the last couple weeks. But, I have the picture of Yankee Stadium there. And you can imagine that if you're playing in front of an empty stadium or reduced capacity stadium, that the signage inside the stadium becomes less valuable, and it becomes perhaps more valuable to get the stadium signage in a spot where it gets picked up by television cameras. For those that can see that visual, you can see Delta in the top right corner. That's probably a sign that rarely gets picked up by a television camera. And if you're playing in front of a reduced capacity audiences, that signage becomes less valuable. I've got here, for those that can see the picture down in the bottom left, the visual here of a bobblehead doll. Those types of sponsored promotions that oftentimes are passed out as fans enter venues. Some of those kinds of things may change. We were talking, a few of us before the seminar started, about how restaurants are shifting away from traditional menus. Sporting events have long passed out game programs. Those game programs typically include advertising space for sponsors. We may be shifting away completely from a physical game program or a tee time sheet for a golf course for a PGA Tour event, to more virtual options and some sponsorship opportunities or some advertising opportunities that you used to be able to offer in a physical format may be shifted to a virtual format. The last just sort of bullet point there is, of course, if we're thinking about reduced capacity, you could make the argument that tickets and hospitality options that are available to sponsors at the event itself could actually be more valuable moving forward, at least that piece of the sponsorship package. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer any questions, anything that you'd like to add in the chat field, but otherwise I will turn it over to Libba.
Okay, thank you, Scott and Sara. And I'm going to be picking up on some of the things that you were talking about. I'm mostly going to be focusing on the legal issues that have been involved and will continue to be involved with the pandemic that we find ourselves in. And I'm going to talk about the lawyers, what sports lawyers are doing, how they're handling these legal issues. And really, when you cut to the chase, right now, sports lawyers are risk managers. And they are primarily trying to manage two different types of risks. One is the risk of contract liability, for canceling events. The other risk is the tort liability that they may face when play is resumed. So I'm going to talk about the contracts first. I think it's hard to make generalizations because a sporting event will have literally hundreds of contracts involved with just one particular event. Sometimes with a big event like the Super Bowl, there will be literally 1,000 contracts that are out there, ranging from player contracts to collective bargaining agreements to venue contracts to media contracts to sponsor contracts, and then all the little ancillary contracts, whether it's for security, parking, merchandise, whatever. And all of these contracts will have different provisions and different contractual ramification when it comes to canceled event. But the first thing that the sports organization and the lawyer for the sports organization is gonna look at is, okay, we're gonna have to cancel events. Okay, we know that the contracts may be impacted, but can we first try to resolve this issue in an amicable way without looking to see what does the contract say about that? We faced that. I was working in the sports industry as chief legal officer for a sports organization when 9/11 hit, and we found at that time that many of these issues could be dealt with because of the situation was such an unexpected tragedy. That at least at the beginning that the issues could be worked out amicably without figuring out, okay, is there a breach of contract or whatever. Also, events were canceled the week. Just about every sports event was canceled the week after the planes hit the towers. And they were impacted going on, but the events picked back up pretty quickly. This is very different. This is a different situation. There are more events, and they're being canceled for a longer period of time. So I think we haven't seen all of the fallout yet, and I think we're gonna be seeing more and more situations of lawsuits involving breaches of contract because people are going to be losing more money. You heard the numbers from Sara and Scott. And so as a result, the lawyers are really scrutinizing the contractual language. Many sports contracts will have what are called force majeure clauses, and Scott alluded to this. That typically cover when, if an event is canceled or if a sports event is covered by an event of force majeure, is canceled because of the event of force majeure, something outside the control of the parties, well, then in that situation, and depending on the particular contractual language, the parties may be relieved from their obligations, either temporarily for a certain period of time, or sometimes completely relieved from their obligations. So what a lot of sports lawyers are looking at, scouring these contracts saying, okay, is cancellation of an event because of a pandemic? Is that an event of force majeure? Now we're used to events of force majeure being, as Scott said, weather. You play an event outside, the weather's bad, you can't play it. Those are common things. But most contracts don't mention pandemics as being events of force majeure. But they are things that are outside of the control of the parties. So we're going to have sports lawyers are looking at these contractual provisions really, really hard right now. And like I said, we may see some litigation over it. And we may not know the scope of it until, and sports organizations may not know the scope of their risk under contracts for some months. Scott mentioned, for example, the Amway Center, which where sponsors are guaranteed sponsorship benefits at a certain number of events. Okay, whether it's a tractor pull, whether it's a magic game, whatever, or a concert. If they don't have those, the venue has trouble meeting its contractual obligations, and it's not going to know the effect of that for quite some time because you don't necessarily know how many events are going to be canceled. Same thing with media contracts, particularly international media contracts, where sports organizations, which is probably one of the most lucrative sources of revenue for sports organizations. Okay, are you going to be able to give your partner broadcaster in Australia? Are you going to be able to give them the 20 events that you promised them? Are you going to be playing 20 events? So those kind of things, those are the kind of things that are a big unknown right now. Another type of clause that is going to be looked at a lot are what's called a make good clause in contracts, particularly media contracts, where if a sponsor, say under a sponsorship agreement, is given a certain number, guaranteed a certain number of impressions or a certain number of benefits under a contract, and if they're not provided with those, the sports organization has to make them good, has to provide different types of benefits that could give them, the comparable benefit to them. So what we may see is that if a sports organization can't fulfill its sponsorship agreements or its advertising agreements, they may have to make good, give them benefits in next year's broadcast, for example, to make up for what they didn't get this year. Another very important kind of contract that sports lawyers are have been scouring, are their insurance contracts, particularly event cancellation contracts. And the insurance contracts or insurance policies are going to be all over the place. Wimbledon was fortunate that they had some people, when they renegotiated their insurance policy 10 years ago or so, this is when SARS had been an epidemic, and they specifically included in their insurance contract that they would be covered if they had to, the organizers of Wimbledon, if they had to cancel the event because of the pandemic. And they got some, maybe $150 million or something in insurance proceeds under that. They were fortunate that they had that provision. I would say most sports properties don't even have event cancellation insurance, and those that do have event cancellation insurance, it's questionable whether they're going to have to litigate whether it covers cancellation by reason of a pandemic. So those things, sports lawyers are going to be continuing to deal with those issues. Going forward, and Scott had mentioned some of the things that he's curious about going forward, and I think we are going to very much see very different types of contracts going forward. The easiest thing is that when sports lawyers are drafting contracts going forward, they're certainly going to include force majeure provisions that include pandemics, so that if an event is canceled by reason of a pandemic, they're going to be relieved from liability. Insurance provisions, I think people are going to be arguing for event cancellation provisions, or sports properties are going to try to get event cancellation insurance and specifically include by reason of a pandemic in the insurance policy. But from what I'm hearing in the industry now, the insurance industry has been very quick to say pandemics will now be exclusions from our policies. So I think those are just a few of the things that I think that were changes that we're going to be seeing, but I'm sure there will be many more. Okay, then that's the event cancellation. Well, as we all know, what people want to do is return to play. This also involves risks that sports lawyers are very concerned about, and the legal question here is under what circumstances is a sport organization going to be liable if its players, if its workers, or if its spectators get the coronavirus at their events? And I think the one thing that's important to remember is that sports organizations are not going to be considered guarantors of the health and safety of their players, of their spectators, or their workers. Just because somebody gets sick at one of their events doesn't mean that they're gonna be liable for that. Instead, how it's going to be scrutinized if they get sued, it's going to be scrutinized under a negligence theory, which and under negligence law, a sports organization will owe a duty of care for the health and safety of its players, its spectators, and its workers. And what that duty of care is acting reasonably under the circumstances to try to make sure to help protect their health and safety. It's not a guarantee, but they must act reasonably. So what sports organizations are doing now is they are very much following the latest best practices, the guidelines of the CDC, World Health Organization, taking the necessary precautions, social distancing of fans, taking fans' temperatures before events. If a worker or a player tests positive, isolating that person, doing contact testing. We saw this past week, Scott mentioned the professional golf tournament, PGA Tour event in Hilton Head, the RBC. There was a player, Nick Watney, right when the tournament began, that tested positive for coronavirus, and they made sure that he was isolated, withdrew from the tournament, was isolated. They did contact tracing with the other players. So you'll see the sports organizations doing that. I think one of the most, well, maybe not one of the most contentious situations, but certainly a very contentious situation now is what we're seeing with the U.S. Open in tennis, where the U.S. Open has said that they are going to go forward with the tournament, but with either no spectators or very few spectators. And what's more, the players can't bring their usual support teams with them. they're going to be liable or are going to be able to only bring one support team person with them. And keep in mind, in professional tennis, professional tennis players have their own coaches, they have their own physios, they have their own mental coaches, they have their own hitting partners. This is part of their team. They're not provided by the ATP or the USTA like in a professional league sport. And some of the players are saying, no, we're not going to compete in that kind of environment without our support team there. So it's going to be interesting to see, where that comes out, whether the top players like Djokovic and Nadal are going to be playing there. One other thing that's important to keep in mind that sports organizations are going to be doing more is getting liability waivers for where fans or workers or players waive any kind of liability on the part of the sports organization if they do contract coronavirus. So sports organizations are now revising their standard form of liability waiver to include waiver of liability for getting the virus. And these waivers of liability, as long as they, describe what it covers, the coronavirus, as long as it's very in clear language, what's being waived, the waiver of the ability to sue for getting sick, they'll be upheld by courts. So that's another thing that sports organizations are doing to manage their risk from the coronavirus. I'm going to talk just briefly, move on to just a couple of other issues, specialized issues, and one is with agents and the implications of the coronavirus on agents. Agents are lawyers, even agents who aren't lawyers deal with legal issues, and there are a lot of challenges that are out there. You've got players that are leaving college and trying to negotiate their contracts now. That's a very difficult thing to be doing, having those types of negotiations in a virtual context. Also in a context where sports organizations are really focusing on, okay, when are the major league sports anyway? When are we going to get up and play? And are not focusing on their player contracts as much now. And I think that's very frustrating, particularly the agents for the rank and file, but not the high profile players. Also, it's very challenging for agents who represent those players that are not the high profile players. When you look at Major League Baseball this year, greatly reduced the number of rounds draft. So you've got a lot of players who normally would be drafted and are now free agents, and that changes the dynamics of negotiating contracts. Players, free agents, not NFL free agents, not being able to work out for the with teams because they haven't had the combines that they had, and teams haven't seen them. So agents have got to get creative in getting their getting the interest in their clients who are free agents. Those challenges may also lead to opportunities, and one of them, as Sara mentioned, was esports. With esports having more popular, particularly during this pandemic, you're going to see more and more agents going over to represent the players in esports. I just want to touch briefly on the impact that this coronavirus has on teachings in the classroom. It actually, having something like this actually makes it in a way a better learning environment for the students, for some of the things that I teach, because now we're not just talking about events like force majeure in isolation, or these tort liability issues, waivers in isolation. We're actually talking about something that is very real. It's not hypothetical. It's not something from in the past like 9/11. And so I think in a strange kind of way, it makes for a better, more impactful learning experience for the student. So I will. That's it for me. And I think this is a good time. If anybody has any questions for any of the three of us, for Sara or Scott or me, we'd love to have them. We'd love to have your questions.
Yes, thank you, Sara, Scott, and Libba, for all the great content tonight. And like they mentioned, we will go ahead and open it up now. If anybody has any questions or comments, feel free to drop those in the chat box and we'll address them. I know we had a couple questions submitted beforehand as well that I'll get to. We did just have one from Dennis Martin. And then whatever, as they come in, I'll kind of read them off. And if they are for a specific person, Scott, Sara, Libba, feel free to jump in and answer it. Or if it's kind of just general for the group, whichever one of you feels comfortable, go ahead and answer. From Dennis, he said, what do you think the financial impact will be to Stetson athletic programs and overall impact to university budget, et cetera? Loss of student enrollment, et cetera. I know no one really knows what any sport program season will look like at this time.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll chime in and then let my my co-panelists jump in if they'd like. Dennis, one of the things that I always I try to emphasize is that for college athletics, it's largely at best a break-even proposition. Most athletic departments operate in the red. There's very few that have operate under profitability, and so we're dealing with a moment where my understanding is that for spring sport athletes, many of them will have the option to come back to play a fifth year. It's also my understanding that schools that made scholarship offers to incoming freshmen for spring sports in particular will still be honoring those scholarships. So what college athletics, whether you're talking about Stetson or Alabama, are going to deal with is you have revenue down across all the major sources of revenue that we've already talked about, at the same time that you got expenses going up. And the question of what sports survive this, whether they all do or whether some schools are going to have to reevaluate, obviously under Title IX becomes a major factor here if you're starting to look at cutting sports. But those are going to be some big questions, and it may not be, could be a temporary pause, I think, for some team sports in college. Whether those are permanent pauses or not, I think is a question that we really don't have an answer to yet. And I'll be quiet at that.
I'd like to add something on just one specific discrete aspect on this that has a big financial impact for college athletics. Is if you look at March Madness, okay, the NCAA's men's and women's basketball Division I basketball tournaments, and let's say generate $1 billion in revenue. It's somewhere in that neighborhood. $1 billion in revenue. Now, as a general rule, 90% of the revenue from the NCAA college basketball tournament is distributed to the Division I schools. So that's $900 million. And it usually is distributed through the conferences to go to the schools that have representation in the tournament. That's a big chunk of change. And so I think that is losing that, the revenue from that is gonna hurt a lot of colleges and universities. How bad is going to depend on the particular school and its financial base, but but that is one big problem. And we don't know exactly what the fallout is going to be, whether some it's going to be just a temporary ceasing of certain sports, whether some schools are going to be dropping sports altogether. I think Brown University in the Ivy League has said that it's going to be moving a lot of its sports into the club status, away from intercollegiate. Furman University has 3 sports, including baseball. University of Alabama at Huntsville, I think, dropped its tennis program and maybe a few others. So it's whether this is going to be temporary or good, who knows? But I think we're going to see more schools at least temporarily dropping from sport. Sarah, anything to add from your end on that?
No, I think it's mainly what you and Dr. Jones had mentioned. Right when the pandemic hit, we saw a few colleges already decide to drop like a soccer program, a tennis program, things like that. And to Scott's point, typically, usually only 10 to 15 athletic programs are profitable, and about maybe another 10 break even. And now we're starting to actually see some of those numbers being fudged a little bit, I would say, to be quite honest, like with boosters money coming in and so forth, to try to, because it'll come out at a perfect zero. Max, who's in watching tonight and part of the one of the attendees tonight, he knows that we talk a lot about this in class. And obviously football is the big revenue generator, and there's lots of talk about there will not be football this fall. And if that is true, then we're not going to see anybody making the revenue that they thought they would, and to actually use that football revenue to support a lot of other programs. Now, there are a few schools who actually rely more on their basketball, but those are far and few in between. And so there will still be different, expenses and so forth that they're going to have to cover no matter whether they play or not. But most athletic programs are not profitable by, thousands are not. So it becomes a very challenging opportunity. As far as Stetson goes, I've not heard anything. I met with athletics today, and there's not been any talk about, programs being cut or anything like that at this point. I think they're really trying to take care of the students and thinking about, students' best interests. I do think that we might see some changes based upon social distancing and, ticketing and some of the different ticketing that might be out there might have to change slightly, or there might be less opportunities, especially if we're not having fans attend the games and so forth. So we may see some differences like that. But as far as like what Dennis was asking about the financial impact, so far we haven't seen anything, but that is most schools have had have kind of stayed quiet on it to see what's going to happen. I think at this point, COVID keeps changing, right? I mean, we're, especially here in Florida, we're back to, I feel like, March, where every day kind of changes and each day becomes something new. So there's so much unknown out there that we'll just have to kind of see what happens.
Yeah, I think I saw someone, Jeff maybe, asked about travel to New York and New Jersey. In the league that we're in, we play football in San Diego and play football in New York and basketball and other sports. ASUN, we've got a team in New Jersey. I don't think any decisions have been made yet on hard and fast decisions on whether we're still going to be traveling to those places. My tells me that if we have to cut costs in athletics, that travel is going to be one of the places that we cut costs. Mm-hmm. We may see less travel. Some of those decisions are going to be made at a conference a conference basis because obviously everybody's in this pandemic together. I think we may see less travel to the more far-flung locations. Yes, and Jeff just mentioned you dropping football, and they're a natural rival, very close. I guess the good thing about that is we managed to pick up some players who transferred from JU to Stetson before the pandemic. But yeah, just one more local, relatively local school that we will not be playing in football.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really important. I mean, I just feel like this is such uncharted waters for everybody, and everyone's just trying to find their footing as far as, you know, athletics and safety and personal as well as a business side of it. There's so much unknown. This is something we've never faced before. Obviously, most of the experts say that this is not as bad as what it could be, which is almost seems, you know, unbelievable in some levels, and that we should prepare for in another, you know, year or two to have something even worse than coronavirus. So it's it could be a lot worse, I guess.
And that question about travel a few minutes ago is actually kind of leading into one that I had, and that could be from either the legal side or maybe it's something that, you know, the Super Bowl committee, I'm sure they'll end up talking about, but how far, you know, up the ladder can this go when it comes to certain states? I know Florida's been very open with their leadership saying, you know, if you are in any, you know, other sports organization, we'll find a home for you here in Florida to play somewhere because we want to get sports back. Whereas a city like California might still say, you know, we're continuing the lockdown for this extended period of time. So when it does come into a situation where it's Stetson playing at San Diego or the Cowboys going to play the Rams on Sunday Night Football, how far can these discussions go up the ladder to where it involves governments or any other outside entities like that stepping in and saying, no, you're not going to play, or yes, we can play, but these are the limitations, anything like that from the legal side?
Well, I'll try to chime in there a little bit. Yeah, I think there's a couple issues here, and Sara and I were talking about this again last week, is to what extent the CDC and you have government entities that are placing restrictions, whether it's on attendance or social distancing. I went down to the Universal Studios soft opening for pass holders, largely because I wanted to see how they were handling crowds. And one of the things that struck me there was how they're now having you order your food and beverage through an app. And it's waiting for you when you get to a restaurant or a kiosk. And I was picturing how concessions at sporting events could be done the same way. There could be a number of laws, you know, rules that get put into place. I think a whole other question is how quickly will consumers come back? And when they do come back, are they going to follow the guidance that is provided? And in the event that they don't follow that guidance, what will sport properties do in terms of, you know, how strict are we going to be in terms of, in some cases, forcibly removing someone from a stadium? That was one of the things I noticed when I was at Universal that day, is that every single employee, it was the first time I had to wear a mask. And there were a couple of times where I pulled the mask down below my nose because it was bothering me the way I was breathing. And I had two different Universal employees make a gesture to me about pulling the mask up. And I'm just picturing the same thing in sporting events when things reopen. It's going to be about training employees. How do you handle people that aren't following basically your guidelines?
Yeah,
And yeah, Alex, I think that your question is, you know, how far up can it go and how far widespread will it go? Scott mentioned, you know, employees, at Universal having to enforce these rules, widespread, and then going up. A lot of these decisions are going to be made by senior management in consultation with state officials. So I don't think there's much of a limit on how far these discussions can go and who's going to be having input in them.
Yeah, thank you both. I think it'll be very interesting to see kind of how all that plays out, definitely as we get back into opening some things back up and getting sports started again. And then one more question I have here from submitted earlier is maybe you've seen it already, or are you anticipating seeing students maybe come into the classroom this coming fall or maybe next spring? And there's kind of that general discouragement right now across the country and in the world about this not being an ideal time for students getting out of college and trying to break into an industry for the first time. So have you all seen, or do you anticipate seeing students come in kind of being discouraged, ones that maybe are looking forward to breaking into the industry, but maybe now being discouraged? And then kind of what advice could you give them, and kind of how will you still kind of keep them on that track and get them to be able to still be excited about breaking into the field while they might have some concerns right now about doing so?
Well, if Libba and Scott don't mind, I'll take this one, or like start off with it. I know that just, I think it was yesterday, 30 UCLA football players demanded to know what the health protections were going to be. So I do, what the great thing is with this generation, so many of them are very ambitious and determined, and they're not afraid to speak up. So I do feel like the great thing about this is that students have a voice more so than ever before. People are listening to them. They have an outlet with social media or with protests and things like that, that I do feel like we see a lot more empowerment for young people, which I think is great, honestly. I mean, you want them to be safe, and I know Stetson's taking a lot of precautions and cleaning and trying to do social distancing and allowing some flexibility in the classroom. But I also think that that will translate to other areas. So whether it's a club or a sport, athletic team, and so forth, I think there's everyone's being very conscious and considerate of that. And people who are not are really kind of being the ones who really get the bad rap, which is great. So that I feel like the vast majority of people are kind of on board, moving in the same direction. But I know that a lot of the football teams are starting to be called back. I know Clemson and LSU, they had 20 or 30 students players who were tested positive for coronavirus. So things like that, I think, show how quickly it can escalate. And so I think universities and colleges, and especially Stetson, is taking all those precautionaries and taking those considerations very seriously, and really trying to follow not only what the and the White House protocols might be, but trying to go the extra step for Stetson students, really making sure that they feel validated and comfortable, and they can be on campus and not be concerned. And like I said earlier, that could change day by day based on numbers and fluctuation and so forth. But I do feel like the university is taking lots of precautionary, thoughtful measures, which they should. It's a large population, and some people live obviously on campus, and other people leave and go back home, and then that can transfer as well, or they could bring it to the campus. So I do think that whether you're a traditional student or an athlete, they're really going the extra measure to try to take the precautionary measures that are needed to make sure that everyone feels safe and healthy.
I was going to chime in, Alex, that I've been talking to a lot of students this summer about some frustrations about internships and things of that nature being canceled. Max has had me in a class before. He knows that I'm a big advocate of the lemonade principle. You take negatives and turn them into positives. And that's really the one thing that I'm going to continue to remind students of, is that, as Sara just mentioned, the one thing we know is that this is going to, the change is going to continue to happen. It's going to be very rapid. And that, in my mind, that there's going to be a lot of opportunities for students as well at this moment. A lot of team sports, professional sports, amateur sports have had to lay off some people. People may have gotten frustrated and decided to go into different industries. There's going to be lots of new opportunities, I think, that emerge. One of the things I'm really encouraging the students is to make sure that they communicate with companies their willingness to work remotely. More and more companies, whether it's internships or full-time employment, may be looking for people that have the soft skills to be able to be productive and efficient employees away from, away from the work, physical work environment. So really just trying to remind students that, yes, there's the change is coming, but those changes represent opportunities as well. You just need to be ready for them. And I know that Libba had a comment there, so I'll be quiet and let her chime in.
No, I was going to say some similar things, that while we've seen hiring freezes in some industries, we're going to see more in sports. I don't think it's any worse than any other industry, and I think there are going to be opportunities for making lemonade out of lemons. Particularly if students are willing to think about the alternative types of sports, and I mean not just the the so-called big four major league sports. Some of the other sports that think about sports commissions, think about different types of opportunities, think about accessible sports. Keep an open mind for the different types of opportunities, and if you do, if you're flexible, if you work hard, you adapt quickly, I think there will be opportunities out there. So I would not be discouraged about getting into the industry.
Yeah.
Great stuff. Thank you all very much. So I am going to leave it for another minute or two. If anybody has any last minute questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat box. I am going to drop a couple things in the chat box very quickly for those on, and this webinar was being recorded, so we'll have that up and available on our website as soon as we get it back from our social media team to be rewatched and enjoyed again by everyone. And in the chat right now, just dropping a couple things. One is our webinar interest form. If you feel free to take a few minutes to fill that out, that's kind of how we build our content that we're going to start producing in the future. So we love to hear back from everybody, feedback, positive, negative, everything. We love to hear it. And then the second link in there is to register for our next Inside the Classroom webinar. Next week, we'll have another School of Business faculty member joining us, and he's going to discuss the PACE program and the continued education offerings and courses that his program is getting set to launch for alumni, students, and anybody interested. And then finally, that third link in there, if you are interested in learning more about the Sport Business program at Stetson, any of the courses, or learning more about the faculty, that link will take you to their page and you can learn more about them and the program. And again, thank you to everybody for joining tonight, and thank you to Libba, Scott, and Sara for taking the time to present with us tonight. It was some really great content and everybody really enjoyed it. So thank you all very much for that.
Yep, thanks to everybody for coming, and thanks Alex for putting it together.
All right, and with that, seeing no more questions coming in, I will go ahead and close it up tonight. So again, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you again to Scott, Sara, and Libba. This was great, and have a great night, everybody.
Bye.